y'all, welcome to my channel. Now this is a part of the true crime segment. This is the heinous crimes of Richard Henyard, the Dorothy Lewis story. Richard Henyard was born on June 26, 1974, was an American murderer executed in Florida for the double homicides of sisters Jamila and Jasmine Lewis in January 1993, and the R-word and attempted murder of the girl's mother, Dorothy Lewis. Richard Henyard committed the murders with an accomplice, 14-year-old Alphonsa Smalls, born on August 18, 1978. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole since he was too young to be executed. On January 30, 1993, Dorothy Lewis and her daughters arrived at a Winn-Dixie store in Eustis, Florida. As Dorothy Lewis, the only survivor, and her daughters, the victims, entered the Winn-Dixie, she noticed a few people sitting on a bench near the entrance. After she exited the store with Jamila, age 7, and Jasmine, age 3, she walked to her car and placed her daughters in the front passenger seat. As she crossed the rear of her car to get into the driver's seat, she noticed Alphonsa Smalls approaching her. He then pulled out a gun that was tucked in his waistband. Dorothy and her daughters were made to get into the back seat as Alphonsa and Richard entered the front. The car pulled out of the Winn-Dixie parking lot and left town with Richard driving and Alphonsa giving directions. Prior to the abduction of Dorothy and her daughters, a witness observed Richard and Alphonsa loitering outside of the Winn-Dixie. During the drive, Alphonsa repeatedly demanded that Dorothy keep the crying girls quiet. She pleaded with their abductors to keep her and release her children. Alphonsa said no, they can't do that. When Richard Henyard heard Dorothy praying, he told her, "This ain't Jesus, this is Satan." Later, Richard, following Alphonsa's directions, pulled the car over to a remote area and took Dorothy out of the car. Richard commenced to R-wording her as she begged him not to do it in front of her daughters. At one point, she tried to grab a nearby gun, but Alphonsa grabbed it first, taunted her, and then also R-worded her. Richard then told Dorothy to sit on the ground. When she hesitated, and Richard shot her in the leg and forced her to the ground. The two got into a struggle, and Alphonsa came over to assist Richard. He then shot Dorothy an additional 3 times at close range, wounding her in the mouth, neck, and head. After she was unconscious, Richard and Alphonsa rolled her over to the shoulder of the road. Dorothy survived, however, and several hours later regained consciousness and went to a nearby house for help. The occupants called the police, and she collapsed and waited for the officers to arrive. As Richard Henyard and Alphonsa Smalls drove away from the scene of the shooting, Jamila and Jasmine Lewis repeatedly pleaded for their mother. Richard pulled the car over a short while later and removed the girls from the vehicle. Richard and Alphonsa took the girls away from the road, out of the clear view of passerbys, and Richard killed the girls. Jamila was shot through the top of her head while Jasmine was shot in the left eye. The assailants threw their bodies into a bush over a fence. Richard Smalls and Alphonsa and a third individual arrived at the home of Bryant Smith in a blue car. Richard bragged about the R-wording and murder of Dorothy Lewis, unaware that she was still alive. He also showed Bryant Smith the gun he used. Later that evening, he went by the Smalls residence where Colinda Smalls, Alphonsa's sister, noticed blood on his hands. He told her that the blood was from a minor knife incident. On January 31st, the next day, Richard's aunt, Linda Miller, agreed to drive him to Alphonsa's house so that he could speak to him. Richard made a trip to the Eustis Police Department that same Sunday, claiming to have info concerning Dorothy Lewis's case. He offered knowledge of the crime and claimed that he was present at the crime scene. His initial story pointed to Alphonsa Smalls and another individual as the perpetrators. However, when an officer noticed blood spots on Richard's socks, he admitted to the kidnapping, R-wording, and shooting of Dorothy, yet maintained that he didn't shoot her daughters. The police apprehended him and discovered the murder weapon after a search of his bedroom. Another teenager, 16-year-old Manuel Yon Jr., was arrested for providing the suspects with a change of clothes. Richard and Alphonsa both attempted to blame each other for the girls' murders. However, they were both found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder under the state's felony murder rule. Richard was sentenced to death on August 19, 1994, and sent to death row to await execution. His death warrant was signed on June 9, 2008. He was executed on September 23, 2008 by lethal injection. The execution was delayed by 2 hours because he had 2 appeals before the U.S. Supreme Court trying to block the execution. Both were denied. His last meal consisted of 2 fried chicken breasts, turkey sausage, fried rice, prison-made chocolate chip cookies, and a Coke. He had no last words. He was the 66th person executed in Florida since capital punishment was reinstated in the United States in the 1970s. Alphonso Smalls was too young to be executed. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Manuel Young was sentenced to 22 months in prison for being an accessory after the fact. He has been in and out of prison on various charges since then. In 2018, he was arrested for beating his girlfriend. Although the charges were dropped, he was arrested again in 2020 on narcotic charges. In 2019, Alphonso was granted a resentencing hearing due to a Supreme Court ruling in Miller v. Alabama declaring life without parole for juveniles to be unconstitutional. During the hearing, his attorneys argued that he was under the influence of Richard Hinyard. Smalls made a statement verbatim. "I know it was a cruel and unusual act. I know I burdened the family a lot. I can't bring that back. It can't be undone. I have been rehabilitated, and the only way I can prove it is to be released from prison." He also claimed that he didn't know Richard until he showed up at his house. Regarding his time in prison, he said he had been a cook there for 20 years and would either start his own business or work for someone else if he was released. The prosecution's argument for him to continue life in prison said that his crimes were planned and that he had been the one in control. They read court transcripts showing that he wasn't nervous or afraid of Richard Hinyard on the night of the incidents. They pointed out that Alonzo had initiated the robbery, refused to release Dorothy Lewis and her children, directed Richard to an isolated area, stopped Dorothy from grabbing the gun when she tried to defend herself, helped subdue her when she struggled. The DA also pointed out to Smalls' prison record, saying that while he wasn't the worst inmate, he had 14 write-ups and 52 warnings, although most of them were for less serious infractions, and only 1 report had been for fighting. Dorothy Lewis, who has since remarried and has a son, asked for Smalls' sentence to be upheld. Circuit Judge Mark Hill, who had presided over the initial trials for Hinyard and Smalls, ultimately decided to sentence Smalls to life in prison. He said he didn't find any mitigating factors, change in attitude, or evidence that he could be rehabilitated. While speaking at Alfonso's prison record, the defendant has failed to provide or demonstrate any measurable ability to be a productive law-abiding citizen. In fact, he has failed to even be a productive inmate. The defendant would pose a severe risk to society, and that such risk outweighs any potential for mitigation of his sentence. Under Florida law, Smalls will eventually be allowed to request another review of his sentence. He is currently housed at the Hardy Correctional Institution. Okay, y'all, thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.